Secretary Rosalin Acosta, our State Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development, and Secretary Jim Peyser, our State Secretary of Education. Let's give them a round of applause, please. And we're here today to share with you some insights into the work of Governor Baker's Commission on Digital Innovation and Lifelong Learning. Over the past 9 months or so, the three of us, as well as a collection of college and university presidents, scholars who work on the future of work and the future of higher education, corporate leaders from companies such as GE and MassMutual and smaller manufacturing companies across the Commonwealth, and representatives of our state's mass hire workforce development system have been joining together to have an important conversation about where our education and training systems stand today, whom they are serving well, whom they are not serving so well, and how we might use digital technologies and digitally enabled solutions to reach more people, especially at a time when we see, despite the success of our economy, there are still many people in our Commonwealth who don't share in the full promise of what our Commonwealth and its economy and opportunities have to offer. So what we're going to do today is I'd like to give you an overview of some of the thinking that led Governor Baker to sign the executive order establishing this commission back in the spring. And then I'll turn it over to Secretary Acosta and Peyser to answer a couple questions that will shed some light on our commission's discourse over these past few months, and then open it up for some questions. So let me start by showing you a slide that I think no one in this room will be unfamiliar with. The narrative around how technology is changing the number of jobs and indeed the shape of work. Those red circles there indicate jobs and occupations in which wages are expected to decline in the coming years, and in fact automation is expected to have a downward impact on the number of jobs. And I would say that on our commission, we don't necessarily believe that the robots are going to eat all of our jobs, but we do recognize that technology is having a big impact on work. And it's time for us as a Commonwealth to begin thinking about what that means for our people. At the same time, the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development, our mass hire workforce system, can predict with relatively accurate certainty what jobs will grow in Massachusetts and which will decline. And if you look at these outlooks over the next decade, you see some interesting patterns. You see healthcare sector jobs really booming. Now again, probably no surprise to many of you in this room. We know that our population is aging. We know that people are living longer. We also see across the state, and this is validated by our regional skills plans that our workforce boards have produced, growth in the IT and manufacturing sectors as well. So we have a pretty good read on how jobs are going to change, what's going to grow and what's going to contract, even as we know that technology is going to change the shape of work. We also hear loud and clear from employers about what they need, and what they most fear is that going forward and today, there will be a lack of available applicants for jobs. Now, there are a few reasons behind this. All of you have been reading about, I'm sure, the declining number of undergraduates, young people going into colleges these days. That translates into a shorthanded workforce. They could also be pointing to classic skills gaps that have existed for a long time and maybe now are accelerating. And we also see that in addition to lack of hard skills, lack of experience, so hands-on opportunities that would give people a good window into how to be successful at a job, employers worry about that, and they worry about employers' lack of soft skills as well. So when you put all these things together, how are our education and training institutions doing today? This graph here shows you a snapshot of some outcomes for two-year public institutions. And we highlight those because they're volume players in higher education. Most undergraduates in our nation and here in Massachusetts are, in fact, community college students. So when you're thinking about workforce and producing a workforce, you look to the community colleges. And what you see here is that many people start at community colleges, but they don't necessarily finish. As you know, community college students often face many different circumstances and challenges in their lives that make that difficult. Many people start and stop. Some people do complete successfully at a different 2-year or a 4-year institution but many 6 years after they start are not enrolled in post-secondary education and haven't gotten a successful credential. Overlay onto that the collapsing business model of the higher education sector itself. This red line, the institutions below the red line, are colleges where the ROI on the education has been deemed to be negative, and the number of institutions that are falling below that line grows greater and greater every year as costs go up, but outcomes stagnate. And we see that higher education is not the social mobility engine that it once was in this country. However, there's a completely different way at looking at the challenges that we face. And we find that different way of looking in graphs like these, which show that the market for adult learners, as opposed to younger learners, in Massachusetts and indeed across the country, is really quite large and really quite untapped. And so when we think about oncoming labor shortages, when we think about what undergraduate education in the traditional sense is and isn't doing today, we have an opportunity to look at this market and figure out how to tap into it more emphatically. We also have a really good read into what learners say they want to be successful. This graph shows you some indicia that learners indicated would be important to them to get them to go to college or to continue in college. And what's really interesting here, this is reflected on the bottom here, when learners were asked, people with some college but no degree, would you go back to college? Overwhelming percentages of them said, no, I'm not really interested. But when they said, well, if we offered you a credit for prior learning type of arrangement, where you could get robust credit for either your life experience or your work experience or your college experience, those ratios flipped. Much higher interest in continuing with post-secondary education. Also, if competency-based education were offered, a format that is not tied to seat time, of course, but is tied to learner mastery of skills and competencies, the interest flipped. So learners, like employers, are telling us something really, really important about what they want to be able to succeed in learning and training opportunities. We'll get to the new learning model that our commission has been cogitating over in just a bit, but I want to turn it over to my colleagues here and ask you first, Secretary Acosta. Your work takes you all across the state, meeting with employers and employees. So when you have those conversations with employers, what are they telling you about their most common concerns regarding the availability of a skilled workforce and the future of our state's economy?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. Thank you for being here. So some of the things that we hear about quite a bit, obviously, is the difficulty in finding bodies, difficulty in finding people, period. And then more sophisticated, difficulty finding talent. But first you need the bodies. So right now Massachusetts is prospering. If you look at our unemployment rate right now, we're at 3.3%. We've been below 4% for about 36 consecutive months now. So what does that create? It creates an extremely tight labor market. We have about 200,000 unique job postings every quarter, and we have 125,000 people looking for work. So you can see that the math there doesn't work. With that said, year over year, December over December, we've added 182,000 people to our labor force. So not typically what you see during a low unemployment time. So we are in a unique position that we are attracting people from other states, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and other states around the country, but we're still having a shortage in some of the talents for employers, and particularly in some of the things that JD touched upon in our priority industries of healthcare, manufacturing, and IT. So we spent a lot of time in our office figuring out how we're going to close that gap, and more importantly, figuring out not just how to close that gap, but how are we going to find folks or help folks train people with the right skills to fit into the current job openings.
And Secretary Peyser, one of the strategies that our commission is focused on and that I know you've taken a close look at is digital learning. Why do you think that is an approach that can be helpful here?
Well, I think there are, if you back up to the problem statement that's just been made and reiterated, which is that we have a skills gap, where we have employers who have job vacancies they can't fill because they can't find people who have the sort of prerequisites in order to fill those jobs. We have people who are underemployed, who aren't sort of fully utilizing their capacity or their skills that they do have. And we have these demographic shifts that are, that are occurring, which is in some ways ratcheting up the challenge for employers and for our economy across the state. All of which is to say we can't afford to let anybody in the Commonwealth sort of sit on the sidelines because they lack sufficient skills or they lack a credential which would allow them to access that job or fill that vacancy that is going to move their career forward and hopefully move our economy forward. So if that's the problem statement, the question we need to ask ourselves is how do we respond to it? And our existing institutions are very good at responding, especially to the extent that there is geographic proximity to the individual, and that the individual has the capacity or the ability to take the time necessary to fit college into his or her schedule, rather than the other way around. But I think we know there are a lot of people, especially working adults or adult learners generally, who can't fit into that schedule, who don't have close proximity to one of our 29 campuses, who have a complicated life such that they need to have an educational experience that is as flexible as they are or as they need to be in order to build their skills and earn credentials. So the first issue is really just access. In order to get access to those people who traditionally have either been locked out or just been unable to get enrolled in one of our existing institutions, they need to have another modality that allows them to go to school, to go to college, to earn a credential on their own time. So the first thing, obviously, with digital learning is it sort of breaks down all those barriers from a geographic point of view, but also typically from a time point of view. There isn't a single day where you register once a semester, and if you miss that date, you're stuck for the next 3 or 4 months. There's a way to be sort of enrolled in real time on an ongoing basis based on your schedule. As JD mentioned, there's also, as I think most of you know, an emerging approach, especially within digital learning around competency-based education, which allows not only for you to pursue your credential or pursue your coursework at your own pace, but it's focused more on the outcome than on the seat time. So you don't have to be in that seat when the teacher is there, either virtually or in person. You can work at your own pace, and you can also build on the skills that you already have to accelerate your progress through the program until you get to a credential. All of that means that you can earn those, you can build those skills, you can earn those credentials at not only at your own pace, but at a faster pace. So you don't need to take as much time as it would otherwise take. And importantly, in many instances, and hopefully increasingly, you can do so at a much lower cost. So having access but not having the ability to pay for it, it doesn't really work. Having both access and affordability, that's what really matters. And then I guess the other thing I'd say, the last thing I'd say on this point, is that sort of by the nature of digital learning, there is this sort of continuous feedback loop which allows for continuous improvement and continuous modification of the program itself, so that we are increasingly and in real time improving not just the quality of those programs and hopefully the success of the students, but also their alignment with employer needs. So as employer needs are changing, we're able to make changes in digital learning curricula and in digital learning programs more quickly than we are with more traditional modalities of, faculty in a classroom with students in person. So I think for all those reasons and more, there's a real opportunity to reach out to unserved populations through digital learning and to bring them into the workforce by building up their skills.
Building on the point you're making about access, Secretary Peyser, it's interesting to observe that so much of our work and attention in post-secondary education and in workforce development has been focused on increasing access for underserved populations. And yet we're seeing those gaps grow wider, not more narrow. Secretary Acosta, talk to us a little bit about the changes in the composition of the workforce that we are seeing, the role of immigrant communities, the role of English language learners, and how we can do better by them to create opportunities to tap into our workforce.
So while I said a little while ago that our unemployment rate is at 3.3%, right, that's an average. and to every average, there's a high and a low. So among our Black and Latino communities, it's 5 and 5.4% respectively. Now, we've cut that down about half in the last 4 years, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. In our budget this year that the governor filed, there are specific dollars based on recommendations from the Black and Latino Commission that he signed into an executive order last year to give recommendations on how to give better access to community, whether it's capital, whether it's training, whether it's ESOL. The immigrant population that JD asked about is extremely important in the Commonwealth. Our birth rates are not going up, they're going down. And in order for us to have a resilient workforce, we are importing not just from other countries, but obviously from our own country. So there's domestic migration, and then there's immigration from other countries. So we know for a fact, especially for folks that do not speak English fluently, that we need to, the English as a second language is a really important step in order to get a job or even get promoted in a job, because we know that there's a big wage gap if you don't speak the language. But more importantly, it's not just about teaching the English in a silo, it's also about integrating that with a job. And making sure that as we're teaching English and helping that someone learn English as a second language, that we're also integrating that with job skills so that there's a pathway. We spend a lot of time in our office, along with Secretary Peyser and Secretary Keneally of Economic Development, talking about pathways, because we understand that if we don't create those K through 12 and then post-secondary pathways and then afterwards, we lose something in the process. And some of our more challenged schools, we need to work harder on those things. And I know Secretary Peyser is very passionate about that. Our voc schools, and we've done a lot in the vocational schools we have our friends from Whittier in the back here, to make sure that we are skilling people, skilling these young folks for the priority industries that we see as important in the Commonwealth over the next few years. So creating those pathways for either underserved communities or immigrant populations is critically important in order for us to create meaningful pathways and segue from education to work in a more seamless way, because right now it's not as seamless as it can be, although we have a lot of great programs throughout the Commonwealth that the kids are working as almost pre-apprentices, and then from pre-apprenticeship to apprenticeship programs to create better pathways to work.
So let me, before I turn it back to Secretary Peyser, give you a sense of how we've put all these observations and points together. And give you a sense of, if not a normative model for what lifelong learning programs could look like, a sense of what we think are probably more important components as compared to the traditional college and training programs that we know today. So first of all, we do believe that there is robust space for the further development of prior learning assessment and credit for prior learning schema in post-secondary education. There are islands of excellence that have these programs. North Shore Community College is a good one, and indeed they're leading a consortium to expand this throughout the state. But it's a relatively under-leveraged strategy that could get to some of the time and cost pieces that Secretary Peyser was mentioning earlier. As we've been mentioning, competency-based education as opposed to seat time schema. It seems to be what the customer wants and also seems to be very successful if you do it right. Student support and coaching. This is one we haven't talked about, but becomes a really important element as we think about how to engage learners who haven't succeeded in traditional education and training programs. And indeed, a lot of the Commission's work has been based off of a pilot program that we put together at Commonwealth Corporation, which engaged Southern New Hampshire University and Partners Healthcare to help give a lift up and a hand up to entry-level healthcare workers there at the company. The student support was a big piece of that program and proved to be quite important in the modeling of this. Soft skill development, you saw earlier how employers really look to that, and you hear all the time, we can train you to do the task, we can train you on the hard skills, but we can't train you how to collaborate, cooperate, communicate, self-advocate, be creative, be entrepreneurial. And so figuring out how to do that more emphatically and planfully seems to be important here. And then finally, we know that different learners learn in different ways, and for some, experiential learning is an important way to learn. And so especially since we are talking about programs that are meant to have a work orientation and help people not just gain a broad skill set, but really advance in their careers. Experiential learning may be important here. Secretary Peyser, as we went forward with our commission discourse, you coined a term. You began speaking about the ecosystem of lifelong learning.
Yes, I made up that word ecosystem. I'm sure you're all familiar with it.
Well, you
really caught on in the last.
It's the phrase.
Few weeks.
But what is an ecosystem of lifelong learning mean to you, and how do we develop one in Massachusetts?
So first, just looking at this picture, as you can see, there are a variety of component parts. And many of those parts exist sort of distinct from one another in organizations that aren't necessarily connected to one another, but the experience that the student and the learner needs to have probably touches on all of those. And so trying to be a little bit thoughtful about how we encourage the development of all of the components of the system, not just individual pieces. Which is to say that this marketplace, if you will, is an emerging one. It's still a young marketplace, even though there have been ed tech companies and ed tech products and services that have been around for a long time. It's still very much, I think, an industry in formation. And therefore, there are a number of gaps, there are a number of disconnects, there are a number of challenges to putting the pieces together, especially from the learner's perspective and from the employer's perspective. So I think there's a role for us to play, some kind of public or public-private entity to play in trying to coordinate, stimulate the development of, and otherwise enable this sector to grow and develop more fully. We had some conversations early on about whether what we really needed to do was kind of create a system rather than an ecosystem and put some sort of boundaries around it, maybe even some regulations, some specific programs. And I think there was a general sense that the market is sort of too young to be thinking about that, and B, we want to actually stimulate innovation and dynamic growth rather than sort of put it in a standardized package. And therefore, what we need to do is create something that's a little bit more flexible and open, an ecosystem, where there's a role for everyone to play, including government, in trying to stimulate the development of this marketplace. And I think there are a few areas where that is potentially particularly important. One is identifying certainly some priorities and mobilizing some resources in order to encourage development of tools, products, solutions, systems in those areas and in those both geographic and from a sector perspective, where we think there's the greatest need or the highest potential. One thing just to keep in mind, certainly here we are in Greater Boston, and you can sort of feel oftentimes in Greater Boston that we have everything here, and why do we need to worry about stimulating anything? It's already overstimulated. But when you get outside of Boston, the opportunities and the level of activity in this space and others tends to decline or become more spotty, and there are too many gaps. And so thinking about how do we spread some of the activity and the innovation that's going on here around the state. But also to try to make sure, the Secretary Acosta mentioned some of our priority industries like IT, advanced manufacturing, healthcare. How do we ensure that some of the development that's going on in the ed tech space and digital learning is actually addressing the needs of those sectors and those employers? Trying to create a more seamless marketplace or a more effective marketplace that matches up learners with employers, that enables employers to engage with educators. Those connections, unfortunately, tend to be very either ad hoc or non-existent, and trying to ensure that there is more connectivity within this sort of marketplace, I think, is another area where we can cultivate an ecosystem that can not only serve students, but can also serve the suppliers or the vendors and the companies and organizations in the space. Similarly, one of the issues within each of these sectors and others is trying to define, well, what are the skills that we're actually trying to develop in our learners? What are the credentials that actually matter both to their skill development and to our ability to hire them? And trying to coordinate across companies, across parts of the state and across different segments of a particular sector to make sure that we are clearly defining what those characteristics and skills are, that we're aligning the credentials that are being offered by our institutions of higher education and other post-secondary providers so that they are delivering to employers what they need, both, again, from a credential point of view and a skill point of view, and to make it easier, importantly, for the learner to navigate this space. And this is sort of the last point, is that if you're a learner, and especially talking about sort of underserved populations who may have some college but have not completed, who may be young people who are sort of disconnected from their education, who may or may not be employed, who, when they sort of look at this picture over here, when they try to understand where the job opportunities or career pathways are, it's a very opaque, hard to navigate, complicated mess. And so trying to figure out how we, certainly on the public sector, but in collaboration with our private partners, can simplify that process, can clarify those pathways, can make it easier for them to get into programs and into organizations and into educational experiences that they're going to put them on a path to success rather than a dead end. And unfortunately, a lot of what goes on, especially in online learning, is a dead end. You go in, you sign up, you get a course, maybe good, bad, or indifferent, but it doesn't lead anywhere. And that's where I think we in particular can be really helpful in helping to define what this system is, create clearer pathways, and by doing, create an ecosystem that can work for the learner and the employer at the same time.
So let's open it up to some questions. We have a couple folks, I think, with microphones available. Yes, sir, you in the back.
Yeah, it's not a question, I just want to say I'm okay, I think I'm loud. Oh, sorry, sure. Thank you. I'd just like to thank Secretary Peyser and Secretary Acosta and Governor Baker. I am from Whittier Tech, the principal of Whittier Tech, where our children, they're looking for the next meal, and we talk about technology. We have one-to-one technology. And I have to tell you, it levels the playing field. And when they talk about workforce development and everything like that, our kids are on the same playing field. So I thank you for giving us the resources. Truly, as politicians and whatever, they are truly for the children. And in the state of Massachusetts, they've given us the resources, from millions of dollars to machine tech, to other types of dental programs where these kids are succeeding. So I thank you very much for what you do. And what you're talking about is the truth. And again, our children that come in, and we're primarily from Haverhill, Massachusetts, 70% of our kids come from there, and they come in to eat, and they're worried about the next meal. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Who's got questions? Over there on the right-hand side, sir.
Great comments, thank you. The question that I have is there's a myth that Boston is a full employment economy. There is a great reservoir of untapped resources. They include early retirees. They include spouses, both male and female, who want to come back into the workforce as family situations change. And there are kids that are graduating for schools that need enhanced digital skills. And all of that provides a lot more resources. And if we can make them more productive, it provides a more robust Boston economy and more growth. How do we get there?
So you're completely spot on, absolutely. And that's why I always get nervous when I talk about averages and I talk about an unemployment rate of 3.3%, right? Because there are a ton of people that aren't being counted, right? And if you're not actively looking for work, you're not being counted in that number. What is your name? I'm sorry.
Rob Sheridan.
Rob. So Rob, no, Ralph, I'm sorry. It's my ears already. It's all those 1970s earphones. What you're speaking about, you spoke about different populations there. We do worry about those populations that aren't coming into the economy, especially right now when the economy is relatively good. And so this is our time to pull people in, because you know that at some point the economy, I don't know when, I'm not making any predictions, but we'll get soft again, and then, we'll be looking for the PhDs again. I mean, right now, there are a lot of jobs out there that do not require a four-year degree. They're high school plus. But you have a lot of folks on the sideline that have either been, there's just so many, and I don't want to take up all afternoon here, but you have chronically unemployed folks, you have people that are underemployed, you have moms that have been, maybe on the sidelines for a couple of years raising their kids, but they want to come back, but they don't want to come back 8 to 5. They want to come back 9 to 2. You have folks that don't want to retire. They're healthy. They're perfectly fine. They have incredible amounts of knowledge, but maybe don't want to work that, that 10-hour day, that 8-hour day. They want to shift down, but they don't want to shift out. So what we have to do and what we need to do is work closer with employers, right? Because we can't do this all from a government seat. This is a collaborative effort, and employers have to be actively engaged with us, as well as our education systems, et cetera. We're doing work right now around, with the Federal Reserve, on a reinventing work program to really look at job quality and look at what are some of the ways that employers can attract new types of workers. In the Commonwealth, our people with disabilities are among the highest unemployed. And these are very high-functioning folks that can go to work, but somehow are not being hired. So there's a lot of education. There's a lot of initiatives that need to be started, and some that need to be scaled. So we also have folks that are on public benefits. And we have an initiative right now called Learn to Earn. And basically, we are trying to help folks that are on public assistance not fall off the cliff. For those of you that know anything about public benefits, if you make over a certain amount of money, then you are at risk of losing your child care, transportation, housing, et cetera. Well, we don't want to punish people for making more money. We want to encourage them to come back into the workforce, but for that, they need a little help. They need a little help from us to change some of the rules so we can smooth that cliff and not have them push off the cliff, because frankly, the incremental money that they may make may not be enough to pay for childcare. I know, I have 5 kids, and childcare is expensive. It's not something that you can make up very, very easily. So great question, and I think we have incredible urgency right now to look at those populations and figure out the best ways to get them into the workforce, because we may have a limited amount of time. When we get a softening of the economy, then those folks sit on the sidelines again. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Jennifer. Hi, Ralph. So I work for an organization, and we teach entrepreneurship to students. And we work around the state. And we actually just launched in Haverhill. But the question is, I think, for this panel is we talk a lot about employers and jobs, right? And I think there's an assumption that we're teaching kids to be job consumers, right? And we're here teaching kids to be job creators, right? Like create your own jobs, create jobs for your friends, right? Whether it's dog walking services, go hire, 5 of your friends to. So can you talk to me about what your thoughts are on educating the next generation of entrepreneurs statewide and not just employees, right?
Can I take a stab at this? I mean, some of you have probably read a really interesting book by the president of Northeastern, Joseph Aoun, called Robot Proof, which is all about how automation is changing the shape of work and what that means for the content of an undergraduate education. And part of the thinking is that if automation is going to lead humans to be less necessary in the doing of automatable skills, then really the focus of learning should be on those generative capacities that a machine can never do. And that's where entrepreneurship and all the components that make entrepreneurship up, like creativity, like strategy, like ethics, like market segmentation, like cultural agility to understand how an issue in one place is different from a business and economic perspective in another, really comes to the fore. So it hasn't been a huge part of our thinking because as you can see, we're modeling more basic concepts here. But when you think about and decompose something like experiential learning and soft skill development, you can easily relate entrepreneurial competencies and capabilities to what we might want to train people and educate people to do so that they are not only able to take a step from an entry-level job into their next job, but also stay employed at that company as that company continues to be changed by the onslaught of technology and automation. So that's one take on that. Secretary Peyser?
No, it's good.
That's good. All right. When the Secretary of Education says that your ideas about education are good, you sort of drop the mic and walk away. Question?
Do I get the next one? Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I have a question that I think encompasses both labor and education. So one of those professions that is not in danger of being automated by robots is teaching. And we've got about 70,000 teachers in this state, and it's a very stable workforce, which is unfortunate because we want them to unlearn how they learned 20, 30 years ago, i.e. 20th century model, and bring them into 21st century model so they can actually serve the population of students we have and serve future employers. What could the state do? What should the state do to make sure that we upgrade those skills of those teachers dramatically and much more quickly than we're doing today?
Well, I have a feeling you may have some ideas about that, so I probably have to turn around and ask you that question. It's a good question. I mean, as I think you know, we have a highly decentralized education system, and so the state, while it does some amount or supports some amount of professional development, by and large, those decisions are made at a local level, at a district, or even at a school level, and are not really driven by state requirements. The state also, however, does establish the requirements for incoming teachers, so for new teachers, and does program approval for schools of education or teacher training programs that are preparing teachers to teach. To the extent that we are trying to shift the paradigm in some way, and I don't want to overstate this because I'm not someone who believes that sort of all traditional teaching is broken. And we can have a longer conversation about that. But to the extent we want to encourage more innovation and more change and more digitally enabled instruction going on in our K-12 school system, I think one way to do that is to think about the front end of the pipeline, in part as a way to design programs for training that are coherent and effective, and another to send a signal to the broader field about where the field is going, as opposed to trying to sort of focus on the installed base, focusing a little bit more on the folks coming into the system. That would be my recommendation. If I sort of had scarce resources, I'd probably apply them there. I do think, though, at the same time, that work also needs to be going on in higher education. In some ways, it's as urgent, if not more urgent, in higher education because of the adult learning issue that we've been talking about here, because of the growing presence of online instruction where existing faculty are being expected to deliver instruction in a very new way, in ways that are not always comfortable to them, but in a way that is sort of an economic imperative for their institutions. So anyway, I'm not sure that answers your question well, but I'd love to learn more from you about what you think we should be doing.
Other questions?
Hello. Oh my God. My name is Julie Yao Cooper. I'm the program director for Simmons School of Business, the graduate programs. And I've been, it's very inspiring to hear this. First of all, we are a school that has invested heavily in online education and has transformed Simmons and really built its mission, about transforming students' lives. not just with the nursing program and the social work program, but you were talking about teachers transforming themselves. Our faculty went from teaching on the ground with a little online to moving their graduate programs completely online in an innovative way. And yes, it was hard, but I really admire how they both embraced and grew from that experience. So that's sort of a little bit of light that it is possible. I had a specific question about all these different pockets of learners that your study and your report addressed. Because when we are going out into the workplace and asking our partners, our corporate partners, and our, like in healthcare or whatever, what they're looking for, they actually really focus on what they call the middle level manager, who really needs more skills, not only to move up, but to make everyone that works with her or him more effective. So our focus now is trying to get that sort of middle level up more, hoping that it's going to trickle down. And I was just wondering if your commission or anything had touched on any of those things, looked at any of those things, or interested in that particular constituency.
Thank you very much for the question. You know, we did talk about where to scope the skill set we were after on this commission. And I'll tell you where we landed. It was in a different place than what you were talking about. Because if you think about it, post-baccalaureate programs are a really good place for managers to get the skills that you just described. Our care and concern is mostly around entry-level workers and people who have been excluded from the workforce, who will be stuck in situations of low-wage work or no opportunity pathway unless we find a kind of highly targeted, bespoke skills-building program so that they can move from that entry level to the next level job. So where middle comes into play for us is not around middle management, but around middle skills. If you look at job growth numbers for the state, and this has been the case in the past and will continue to be for the future, even though we have a lot of high-skilled jobs in the Commonwealth and a lot of high-skilled workers, the greatest job growth is going to be for those middle-skilled jobs, and we actually have a shortage of middle-skilled workers. So one of the best things that we think we can do through the work of this commission and expanding models is to give people who would be in low-wage, lower-skilled jobs, entry-level jobs, an opportunity pathway into more middle-skilled work, and that's what we hope to do.
Quick comment. So that is where we focused our attention. However, I just want to relate a story that the governor has told that relates to this work that we're talking about here. There was an individual in state government, a fairly experienced senior manager, sort of really one step below the commissioner level in one of the agencies. And the commissioner who was in that position left, creating a vacancy, and this person was the perfect person for that job. He knew the agency, he knew the work, he was effective at what he did, he was ready for greater leadership. But he didn't have the requisite bachelor's degree in order to be qualified to actually occupy that position. And the governor tells this story because A, he wonders why do we have these kinds of credential requirements that aren't actually related to the job that needs to be done. And B, why don't we have a way for somebody like that to, in an accessible, affordable, time-sensitive way, complete their degree or credential so that they can move into those positions without having to, enroll in a course of study that may take them a year or two to finish. So the point is, this is degree completion and sort of post-secondary or postgraduate credentialing, I think, is a huge market. I think there are a lot of people who are very much interested in that market, and Simmons may be a great example of one that can fill it, which may mean it's not quite as much of a gap as perhaps the one that we were addressing. But I think it's a big deal and a big opportunity, and I think it's important that Simmons and others address it.
So we'd like to thank you very much for coming to our session today. You've come to us at a time when our commission's work is just about wrapped up. We hope to unveil in a more public way some actual recommendations and steps forward in the coming weeks and months. But we hope that we've given you a good sense of what we've been thinking about, our target population of learners, our target sectors, and a kind of model for how we might go about this in the service of building the dream of an ecosystem of lifelong learning. So thank you all very much.